In this mini grammar lesson, we'll talk about relative pronouns. The most common relative pronouns in English are which, that, who, whom, and whose. They introduce relative clauses. What are relative clauses? Relative clauses are a type of dependent clause that modifies a word, phrase, or idea. The word, phrase, or idea that they modify is called the antecedent. For example, here we have two clauses. The second clause, Joan drove this car, modifies the noun car by giving us more information about the car. We can join these two clauses together with the relative pronoun that. So we have, this is the car that Joan drove. The first part, this is the car, is the main clause. The second part, that Joan drove, is the relative clause. The relative pronoun that relates back to the noun car. Here's another example. The student graduated from Yale. He won the spelling bee. We can join these two clauses together with the word who to make the sentence, the student who won the spelling bee graduated from Yale. The student graduated from Yale is the main clause. Who won the spelling bee is the relative clause. It modifies the noun student by giving us more information about the student. The word who relates back to the noun student. Notice that in the first example, the word that is used because the car is a thing. In the second example, the word who is used because the student is a person. There are two types of relative clauses, restrictive and non-restrictive. Relative pronouns that introduce a restrictive relative clause are not separated from the main clause by a comma. The information in the relative clause cannot be omitted because it is crucial for understanding the sentence's meaning. For instance, this sentence contains a restrictive relative clause. This is the store is the main clause. That had cream-filled donuts is the relative clause. The relative pronoun that relates back to the noun store. If you take away the relative clause, the sentence doesn't make sense. Relative pronouns that introduce non-restrictive relative clauses are separated from the main clause by a comma in most cases. A non-restrictive relative clause contains information that is not crucial for understanding a sentence's meaning correctly. Here is a sentence with a non-restrictive relative clause. Her dad is a pediatrician is the main clause. Who is very funny is the relative clause. The relative pronoun who relates back to the noun dad. If you take away the relative clause, the sentence still makes sense. Her dad is a pediatrician. So now you know the basics about how to use relative pronouns. Let's review. Today we learned that relative pronouns like that, which, and who introduce relative clauses, which are dependent clauses that modify a word, phrase, or idea. We also learned that there are two types of relative clauses that relative pronouns introduce. Those are restrictive relative clauses, which contain essential information, and non-restrictive relative clauses, which contain non-essential information. Knowing whether a clause is restrictive or non-restrictive tells us when to use a comma to separate the relative clause from the main clause.